Recently, I've seen a lot of people on the internet claiming that fantasy writing on the whole is just bad. And I'm sorry to say, but if you're making this argument based purely on a writing quality spectrum, you're wrong and you're being an elitist. So, for context, I was inspired to make this video because of something I saw on, of course, the beginning of all hellscape horrors that isn't Tumblr, Reddit. And I was looking, even though I am not at this point yet, for my own personal amusement, to see, because I was curious if there are any master's programs that were fantasy literature specific. And I looked and I found a Reddit thread through Google, and it brought me to fantasy literature. And I'd already discovered at this point that the University of Glasgow has a fantasy literature master's program. Only one in the world, they're very proud of it. Really cool. But someone on this Reddit post had replied something along the lines of, I think the reason they don't have a lot of these programs is because on the whole, fantasy literature is bad and it doesn't count as literature. And there were a couple, things listed. And the thing that I found really interesting was the way that it categorized just bad writing versus ideas that are okay, but are still badly executed. And in this case, one of the options given was A Song of Ice and Fire and things like that. And I was just left flabbergasted because I write fantasy literature. I read a lot of fantasy literature. I'm a big fan of fantasy literature. One of my Christmas gifts was a Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature, magically cut to the Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature. I got this book for Christmas. It is an incredible book. I'm really enjoying it so far, and it is an exploration of fantasy literature historically and how it brings us to the modern genre and academic explorations of it. Do you know what's included in the front timeline of this book, The Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature? What is considered a literary work under the guides of Cambridge University. Stephanie Meyer's Twilight. So yeah, if the title didn't give you enough of a clue, today we are going to be disproving the myth that fantasy literature is bad writing and that the idea of fantasy literature does not exist. And I've got receipts, so let's sit down, have some fun, and discuss. Before we get into it though, hello everyone, my name is Rowan. I like talking about literature and media, and especially fantasy, here on my channel. And if you're interested in seeing more videos like this one, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more. Today, as aforementioned, we are going to be discussing fantasy. Specifically, the myth that fantasy, on the whole, is just badly written stories. So when people make this argument, I feel the need to establish that what they consider good writing usually just means the classics. And this is not to say that the classics are not good. They are. There's a reason they're classics. There's a reason they're taught for ages and ages and ages. However, as I am me, I feel the need to remind all of you that the classics, if you're not aware, I'm an English history major, I am aware, were not always classics. When Shakespeare first published his very popular, very famous works, they were, say it with me now, not very popular with elitists. The idea of classic literature is a myth. Classic literature is just a literature that is successful enough and popular enough that it then later gets analyzed 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years down the line. And yes, these literatures were often popular, but they were often considered the lower level popular literature. There is a deep history between the concept that popular literature is bad and popular literature is not well written, in contrast to the elite, harder to achieve thing. This is not even just literature specific. For throughout a large proportion of history, the popular thing was often seen as the low-class common thing, whereas the rare, expensive, higher level, complex thing was seen as more literary or artsy. One of my favorite examples of this is my favorite artist, Vincent van Gogh. When his art was being first painted, it was looked down upon. It was hated. He barely made any money off of it. He is now known as one of the best Impressionist artists of all time, and millions of people fly over to visit his work at its various museums every year. There was a Vincent van Gogh exhibit at the MFA in Boston a few months ago, and I happily went to see it because I love his works. Van Gogh is a fascinating and important artist, but in his time, he was considered lowly popular class work. This same opinion has often been applied to fantastic literature in the past couple decades because of the boom fantasy has been seeing on the whole. And some of you are already going to the comment section and are going to write a critique of this, asking me, well, Rowan, what about quality of writing. And in this case, this usually means quality of prose. Well, my friends, I'd like to introduce you to our old friend, favorite of classic literary students and TV adaptationers, Charles Dickens. Now, we're going to brush past A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is its own thing and also appears in this book, by the way, because it is fantastic literature. It has ghosts. We're gonna look at A Tale of Two Cities. I've read A Tale of Two Cities twice now. I'll probably have to read it again at some point for one of my college literature classes. I enjoyed it. It's a good book. I want you all to look me in the eye. Anyone who's read A Tale of Two Cities, okay? I want you to look me in the eye and tell me that on a technical prose level, that book is well written. By a modern or even a then standard, the amount of semicolons and commas this man uses in a given 100+ word sentence is insane. In my copy of the book, there were paragraphs that lasted for 2 straight pages. I'm sorry to say, but on a technical prose level, the classic masterpiece that is A Tale of Two Cities is in fact far less refined than any given modern fantasy book that I have recently read, if we're including run-on sentences as a problem. When people talk about good writing, they very rarely actually care about quality of prose. They care about quality of interest. And even more so, I think it's important to emphasize that these classical writers are not bad because they did not follow all the rules of grammar. In fact, they are often revered for it. The problem is that these classical writers are revered for not following the rules of grammar, while more modern writers who maybe do, but for instance have a less flowery prose style or a more easily accessible writing style, are seen as lowbrow bad writing. This is an elitist dog whistle. It is the same elitist dog whistle that was used, in fact, against the authors of these classic tales. Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare were both seen as low-class common people's writing, and they wanted to. Charles Dickens wrote with an then easily accessible writing style. It's why his books are still read to this day. This distinction that is often drawn between classic writers being these immense literary geniuses and modern writers not is simply a false narrative. It's historical revisionism at its finest. We, as the modern day audience, cannot possibly comprehend how these common popular stories could be works of literary mastery. And love it or hate it, the issues with it can be discussed at a later date. I'm not getting into it in this video. The same criticisms were used against Harry Potter as well, that it was children's literature, that it was pointless and bad, and that the popular thing could therefore not be the good thing. And I'm not talking about if it's good or not. However, I am talking about if it is popular or not. And the thing about popular literature is that popular literature is influential on genre fiction as a whole. And that is that a popular thing can inspire dozens of different writers to follow it. Again, people have been adapting Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol for centuries. The popular thing and the well-known thing are not necessarily bad. The question is, in this case, what qualifies as good writing? Well, for today's discussion, good writing is not necessarily a work of prose or even a work of alleged literary mastery. Good writing is a symptom of engaging stories. Because that's the thing. Good writing has never been about the prose. It's been about the story. The most popular stories in history weren't even well written, fairy tales or fables or things that have been rewritten time and time again. Or, in the case of the best-selling novelist in history, Agatha Christie, they're repetitive stories that are changed and shifted with each new book, creating a new mystery that's interesting for the viewer who liked the one before. These are not great works of newfound prose mastery. This isn't War and Peace or Dante's Inferno. But they are interesting, engaging stories. And that is what creates a piece of truly good writing. If you can engage in a story, you will want to analyze it. You will want to be invested in it. You will want to explore it on a later date. That is what creates literary interest, and more importantly, that is what creates lifelong readers. The idea that literature must have some grandiose message or theme is absurd, but at the same time, while I'm arguing against this, a lot of writers have spoken about this very same problem. Notably, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis quite often got into arguments about the validity of allegory. As modern literary critics often try to claim, allegory is in everything. And while it may be an old meme, a lot of classical writers did not write their works with the intention of allegory being in every detail. They did write their works in certain contexts, which is why when you study Jane Austen's works, you explore the circumstances of her as a person and of the historical context of the time. Why was marriage and social class so important to Jane Austen? Well, because it was important to women and men of the day. And her audience would have been invested in these love stories because of the economics of marriage. Ah, the entail. I wrote an essay on the entail once. It was pretty fun. In essence, the mark of a good writer, especially a good genre fiction writer and a good fantasy writer, is a depth of characters, story, and plot that push the reader, or in some cases viewer, to engage further with the world and story, and to find meaning in what they are consuming. You can find meaning in anything if you look hard enough. Back in December, I analyzed the literary merits of the 2000 Grinch That Stole Christmas film in relation to anti-consumerism. It was a pretty fun time for me because I really love that film. But I don't think anyone would claim that film is some grand work of classical cinema. But I found meaning in it. It's a good story. It's a story I can reconsume over and over again, like the classics. They're classics because people love them, because people want to go back to them. And again, I feel it's really important to emphasize here that another argument against fantasy writing, especially in modern literary circles, is the idea that genre conventions make bad writing. No, genre conventions make for an interesting story that fits into its genre. They don't make bad writing. Writing is repetitive. In an interview that I recently rewatched between Brandon Sanderson and YouTuber Hello Future Me, Brandon emphasizes how every writer is really just stealing inspiration and stories from another writer. Nothing is original.
To talk about inspiration.
Yep.
There's the old line that the best writers steal, I think it is. I don't know who said it originally, but
it's like good writers borrow, great writers steal.
Yeah, that's right. And we're constantly taking in things from the world, from the books we read, from the films we watch, from the shows we like, and incorporating them into our works.
Yeah.
That's not to say that no writing is good or nothing's original, but the writings of Jane Austen, of Charles Dickens, of William Shakespeare, they were not one-offs. They were not entirely new ideas. They were amalgamations of cultures and ideas and things that already existed. The popular thing is not bad. It's just common. And while many elitists may try to convince you that it's bad, it is in fact an excellent gauge of truly far-reaching stories that we should all consider exploring when we find interest in them. Now, because this is a video essay, and as I mentioned, I'm also a history major, we have reached the brief historical divergence section of this video essay. Most importantly, we're going to be discussing Ursula K. Le Guin and use that as a jumping off point for the anti-genre fiction tendencies of history. In her 1974 essay, Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons?, Ursula K. Le Guin explores the anti-fantasy tendencies of Western society, America specifically. In wondering why Americans are afraid of dragons, I began to realize that a great many Americans are not only anti-fantasy, but altogether anti-fiction. We tend, as a people, to look upon all works of imagination either as suspect or as contemptible. Such a rejection of the entire art of fiction is related to several American characteristics: our Puritanism, our work ethic, our profit-mindedness, and even our sexual mores. To read War and Peace or The Lord of the Rings plainly is not work. You do it for pleasure, and if it cannot be justified as educational or as self-improvement, then in the Puritan value system, it can only be self-indulgent or escapism. For pleasure is not a value for the Puritan. On the contrary, it is a sin. Equally, in the businessman's value system, if an act does not bring in an immediate, tangible profit, it has no justification at all. Thus, the only person who has an excuse to read Tolstoy or Tolkien is the English teacher who gets paid for it. But our businessman might allow himself to read a bestseller now and then, not because it is a good book, but because it is a bestseller. It is a success. It has made money. To the strangely mystical mind of the money charger, this justifies its existence, and by reading it, he may participate a little in the power and manna of its success. If this is not magic, by the way, I don't know what is. This excerpt of Ursula K. Le Guin's essay is a really important jumping off point, not because it establishes anything that you as the average fantasy consumer don't already know, the amount that people dislike fantasy for seemingly no given reason, but because it also establishes a discussion of the historical impact of this, which Ursula K. Le Guin also brings up. I suspect that almost all very highly technological peoples are more or less anti-fantasy. There are several national literatures which, like ours, have had no tradition of adult fantasy for the past several hundred years. The French, for instance. But then you have the Germans, who have a good deal, and the English, who have it and love it, and do it better than anyone else. So this fear of dragons is not merely a Western or technological phenomena. So, why are Americans afraid of dragons? Ursula K. Le Guin's thesis in this essay is focused, as mentioned, on a fear of the unknown, on a fear of the unproductive, and most of all, on a fear of that which brings the reader pleasure. This, my friends, takes us to the Puritans. The combined force of puritanical religious beliefs and the Industrial Revolution created on the whole, a more modern idea of an anti-fantastical nature. If you look historically at the most popular pieces of literature, especially, as Ursula K. Le Guin mentioned, in the literature of England and the United Kingdom at large, you will find a deep history rooted in fantastical beings, myths of magic or swords or chivalry. The Arthurian legend ideal, the code of chivalry, which is a founding influence on many of the Romantic poets, is in itself a fantasy born of myths and heresy. It is a misnomer that the Catholic Church was the destruction of most fantastical myths within the European canon. In fact, the greatest destruction to this acceptance of fantasy and magic did not come until far later during puritanical revolutions following even the Reformation caused by Protestantism. This puritanical shift in personal ideology and this emphasis not on a greater acceptance of the fantastical or the mythical, but of the mechanized scientific realism brought on by the Industrial Revolution, created a tonal dissonance between the literary canon, i.e., the history that most popular classic works at this time included ideas of fantasy, be they fairies or ghosts or monsters, and the popular consensus at the time that fairy tales were for children and well-learned adults, especially well-learned adult men, could only consume the most important scientific learning of the day. This puritanical ideology was, as Ursula K. Le Guin referenced, relatively popular in various Western cultures. But in America specifically, it reached new heights. Why? Because unlike various other cultures, due to the after effects of colonialism destroying older cultures, myths, and religions within the Americas, the United States didn't have a already built-in culture of historical myths or legends that was widely accessible to the average citizen. In rural England, during the height of the Industrial Revolution, there were still various mixes of Christianity and paganism flourishing. Even so far as the Edwardian period, folk traditions that existed for centuries still remained prevalent. In contrast, because of, again, the after effects of colonialism and the destruction of traditional indigenous American belief systems and religions, this destruction of myths and culture created a breeding ground for science-first, science-focused society. And I'm not saying science is bad. I'm saying the separation of science and humanities brings us to people who are anti-fantasy and brings us to the literary elitism that is anti-genre fiction to this day. Following the Industrial Revolution, there were still some semblances, at least, of fantasy in America, though they were mostly imported, as mentioned in Ursula K. Le Guin's writing, from England. American fantasy as a cultural tradition was not, on the whole, popular in terms of mass literature, and definitely not in terms of respect for literature. However, this battle, this moral panic about the validity of fantasy would not become truly mainstream until after Le Guin's essay was already published. Because yes, we're talking about the Satanic Panic. No, I don't want to talk about the Satanic Panic, but here we are. The Satanic Panic, which happened in the 80s, was a period in which people thought that their children were being turned to Satan because of the fantasy game D&D, among other things. It has had a couple resurgences, including a weird one in the early 2000s and rare offset ones. But I digress. This isn't the point. We're only mentioning the Satanic Panic because it is important to the larger discussion of why fantasy is still seen as not a literary genre. There were tons of fantasy series that came out between Tolkien and Harry Potter, but aside from the Chronicles of Earthsea, Dune, which is sci-fi but often gets lumped in with speculative fiction genre as a whole at this point, Star Trek, Doctor Who, Anne Rice, and maybe The Chronicles of Amber, there are very few fantasy stories written between this time that would receive any attention in the modern day as important, influential, or memorable. And this isn't to say there aren't others. There are hundreds, there are so many fantasy books that were published between Tolkien and Rowling. But the modern popular narrative is that there was none, that fantasy wasn't really a thing before Harry Potter, that the modern fantasy genre is a world into of itself that is destroying modern literature. I'm sorry to say this, no, it isn't. Fantasy has always been one of the most popular genres, and it will continue to be one of the most popular genres. As I've already established, a lot of classic literary works are works of fantasy fiction. This is a fact of history. Fantasy is important, it's influential, and it is interesting. Fantasy stories, fairy stories, as Tolkien liked to refer to them, have always been popular because people enjoy escapism and going into other worlds and exploring and experiencing things that they don't understand. This is an important detail. This is why fantasy remains so popular to this day. If you look at a list of the best-selling authors of all time, the two genres that pop up the most and consistently, I'll insert some video of me scrolling through it here, are fantasy, romance, and mystery. Already mentioned Agatha Christie earlier in this story. All three popular genres that are often excluded from literary discussion and abandoned by popular media and especially literary critics. Why? Because to them, this is worthless. This is pointless. These are considered children's literature, common literature, or my personal favorite, women's literature. Oh, that dirty term, women's literature. We're supposed to hate it, apparently, because women couldn't possibly have any taste in literature. It's not as if women haven't been writing literature for centuries. It's at this point that I'd like to bring up Christine de Pizan's The City of a Thousand Ladies. Let's look at that copyright. Ah, yes. Women have only really truly been writing genre fiction for the past 50 or something years, and Shelley, Bronte, and Austen are the only exceptions to this rule. Sure. Fantasy is objectively one of the most popular genres throughout all of history, especially in Western literature. And I'm not claiming to be an expert on Eastern literature. I have not studied Eastern literature. I would love to at some point because I think they have a lot of fascinating myths and cultural stories and differences in storytelling. However, by just the cursory knowledge that I have of manga and anime from a couple of my close friends who are big fans of it, I think they have a pretty big tradition of fantastical stories as well. One of the more popular examples of Eastern stories within Western canon would be Hayao Miyazaki and his various stories across various films, such as Howl's Moving Castle or Spirited Away. And yes, I've actually analyzed Spirited Away for a literature class before. It was an experience. In this video specifically, I'm highly focusing on, again, that Western literary canon and this idea that genre fiction is bad, actually, that fantasy writing is bad, and there's only a rare example of a good fantasy writer, because fantasy writers don't write literary works of mastery. They write common folk things. They write the thing that the everyman wants. They write relatable characters, the horror. No, Gary, you just think that nothing aside from self-help businessmen books have any value because fantasy is a pleasurable source of entertainment, and to you, that can only come from buying more stuff. Sorry, I had to go on the rant. People complaining about fantasy writing being bad actually aren't doing it because fantasy writing is, on the whole, literarily bad. These types of people think that the only types of fiction that have any value are high art literary fiction that makes no sense and takes years and years and years to properly analyze, because why not? Their value system and philosophies are based simply on a technical complexity level. The more confusing or complicated or absurd something is, the more literary it must be. A lot of these people, I guarantee you, are also big fans of those weird modern art pieces with the banana plastered on the wall. Or, my personal favorite, the ones who really want us all to have those home assistant robots. Yes, I watched iRobot too. No, I did not get let's just do it better. I got let's leave it alone. Genre literature, especially fantasy and science fiction, is a realm in which writers and their readers can explore complex topics and themes surrounding history, politics, science, and society as a whole, among other things. And be that as it may, dislike it as you may, even Sarah J. Maas's fantasy books explore these topics. Even Cassandra Clare's fantasy books explore these topics. Cassandra Clare, I think, is a good example here because I think it's really important to bring up to all of you that, like it or not, these YA books are making a point. In the ending of her Mortal Instrument series and the follow-up in the Dark Artifice series is a, be it intentional or not, allegory for the consequences of partitioning an entire country or civilization because of the actions of a few of its members, and the distrust and hatred that can brew because of it. It is quite clearly a reference to a system of historical consequences best seen between World War I and World War II, but that has also come up across various other cultures and countries throughout history. The old saying, history has a tendency to repeat itself, is one of my favorite things when it comes to literature, especially when an author has the time to explore or play with these societal conventions and consequences. And yes, they have romance, and yes, they have teen-level writing, but that's because Cassandra Clare's books are YA. They are not works of pure literary mastery. Rereading the first 3 books in the Mortal Instruments is pretty hard for me, which is why I don't usually do it. But as her books progress, her writing increased in quality, and they're easier for someone over the age of 15 to consume. That said, it's still a story with something to say about the real world. And I'm not saying it has to be. Stories can often be relaxing and fun and escapist. I saw a video yesterday that I think really connects to this, that basically boils down to the reason that smart women, that doctors, that lawyers, that the PhD students really enjoy bad romance novels is that sometimes they just need to turn their brains off, and I can relate to it on a fundamental level. But I don't just love fantasy because sometimes I can turn my brain off because, like this month, when I decided to binge read everything Sarah J. Maas has ever written, I needed a hit of pure insanity. I enjoy a good CW show now and again, but I still analyze them. I still explore genre conventions because genre fiction is fascinating and I love it dearly. Fantasy writers are good writers because they create compelling and interesting stories. Fantasy writers create immersive settings and characters that make the audience react and want to keep reading over and over again. And many critiques, again, against fantasy writing come to the writing style, the prose, and especially when it comes to YA fantasy, the juvenile tropes or word usage used. Yes, and it's an accessible reading style. Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare wrote accessibly to their audiences at the time because something that is easily accessible, easy to understand with basic vocabulary is really important, especially to get people reading. It comes back to Harry Potter once again because, again, love it or hate it, issues or not, we're not getting into that today, even though, yes, they're there. Harry Potter was an easily accessible story that millions upon millions of people were invested in when it first came out. They loved it because they could easily get invested and easily consume the content. It is not Tolstoy, in which people need entire classes and degrees to learn. Literally, I had a friend who had an entire class on Tolstoy last semester. It was a whole class, just entirely devoted to Tolstoy. And she still didn't cover even a quarter of his works. Charles Dickens and Shakespeare use the same strategies that Rowling, Meyer, Cassandra Clare, and even today, Sarah J. Maas do. They write books that appeal to a mass audience. They write books with interesting stories, creative characters, invested emotions, and most importantly of all, an easily accessible writing style. They create something that is easy for people to consume and enjoy. And that is not bad. That is why a lot of fantasy and, to a lesser extent, science fiction are ridiculed and hated. Because to the average literary elitist snob, they are something accessible to the common people, a gateway into literary interest for the average person. Fantasy is not on the whole badly written as the Redditor who inspired this entire video and the various people I've seen complaining about it on YouTube and Instagram over the past few weeks say it is. Fantasy is, in fact, one of the most interesting, complex, and popular genres in all of literature. And it will remain popular. It will remain successful because, like romance and like mystery, there will always be a market for fantastical escapist stories, especially in a society that is continually becoming heavily mechanized. There was a boom of specifically very popular fantasy stories in the Victorian era. Alice in Wonderland became a bestseller. Charles Dickens, with his vaguely fantastical stories on the whole, became immensely popular. And many, many more. The entire first essay in this book is devoted to listing dozens and dozens of them. Fantasy is a genre that becomes popular when the average person needs an escape. And the average person has needed an escape for a very long time. There is a deep history of fantasy being rooted in myths and stories and combinations of factors. And that is beautiful and lovely. But if your critique is that fantasy is bad actually because it's badly written or the prose are too easy to understand or too sloppy or too descriptive, well, I'm sorry to say that's not a problem. In the modern day, yes, there is a certain metric for bad writing, and that metric, in my mind, is a lot lower than most people seem to put it. Most people consider accessible writing, they consider things that are lower level, that are easy to understand, to be bad. I've seen a lot of people read Throne of Glass and then go, yeah, the series isn't for me, because they consider it to be a lower level of writing. And that is true. It is, of the books in the series, the least well written, because it was the first book she'd ever published, and that's usually what happens. But the overall quality of the story and content of the story and characters, especially as it progresses and you reach the later books in the series that begin to rival George R. R. Martin in terms of length. Well done, Sarah. Your entire published works at this point are probably as long as The Winds of Winter, considering it has taken you the same amount of time to write all of them as it has George to write it. Sorry, I had to include that joke. It's a video about fantasy literature. You think I'm not going to make a The Winds of Winter has still not come out yet joke? The irony is I'm filming this video like a month before I'm going to post it, and there probably will be Winds of Winter news before then. If there is not something that is coming on screen right now, that means I was right and there won't be Winds of Winter news before then. Fantasy, especially here, and I really want to emphasize this, is the punching bag of elitist literary snobs who consider those who disagree with them, especially women, minorities, or even men who disagree with them, to not be able to share their stories and their ideas of different worlds, of different societies where things were different. In fantasy, an author can create a story in which the hierarchies are entirely different, where society is matriarchal instead of patriarchal, or where there's a system of elected princes as if it's 1600s Germany all over again. Fantasy allows for a writer to create a system or a society or a world and explore what that means, to play in their own special world. This is another one of the reasons that I think a lot of popular fantasy is disliked. And I'm not saying all fantasy is good. I'm not saying that there aren't bad fantasy stories. I'm not saying that Fourth Wing is a literary masterpiece. There are problems with it. There are problems with A Court of Thorns and Roses, a lot of which are ironically fixed in A Court of Mist and Fury when it becomes far more plot focused. Yeah, I was surprised too. But I am saying that simply stating that all fantasy is bad, actually, because all fantasy is pointless, or even claiming things like A Song of Ice and Fire are bad because they're too long, they're too interesting, they're too flourishy. Yeah, it's called epic fantasy. It's a genre. You don't want to read 1,000+ page books? Don't pick up epic fantasy. That's what you get when you sign up. People who think that fantasy is bad purely because it can't possibly be good, and the idea that genre fiction is bad because it's pointless or worthless or the prose are bad, are wrong. They're being elitist snobs, and they're often hypocrites, because this same person will turn around and tell you that Paradise Lost is an excellent work of literary mastery, or that A Christmas Carol is majestic, or my personal favorite, that Hamlet is perfection, literary mastery. Hello, everyone. Look me in the eye when you say that. Look me in the eye. They're all fantasy. The idea that classical fiction is not fantastical and that it's in fact literary and without any flaw is a dog whistle. It's fake. It's a thing you're saying because you have an agenda that you really want to push. The agenda that what is common, what is interesting, fantasy, science fiction, romance, mystery, genre fiction that is more popular at any given time and higher on any given bestseller list than the average nonfiction self-help title or all of those riveting nonfiction scientific journals are in fact the peak of literature. The peak of literature is subjective. There's a reason that literature has been studied for hundreds upon hundreds of years and will continue to be studied, hopefully for hundreds and hundreds of years if we aren't all imploded first for reason A, B, or C. I'm not going to name the reasons, but you know what I'm talking about, I hope. Fantasy is a genre filled with fascinating questions, really well-developed, fun characters. Fantasy is a genre that anyone can write in or create a story that becomes their own. It is not as constrained as these literary snobs who will at the same time go only writers such as Tolkien, Lewis, maybe Barrie or Carroll fit into. These people do not understand what makes fantasy amazing because they don't want to. They want to pass their unknowing opinion onto us fantasy readers and diminish our importance, make us think that we are worthless. We're not. Our genre has worth. Our genre has interest. And most importantly, I think it's important to bring up here that the fantasy genre is critical to the development of empathy and imagination, two things that we in the 2020s are severely lacking. There have been various studies, I'll find one of them and place results up here, that I have read over the years that emphasize the importance of genre fiction and especially fantasy in developing people's empathy and people's understanding of other groups and cultures. And even more so, I think it's important to emphasize that imagination and creativity are critical to innovation. The most famous inventors in history were often surrounded by literature, by the humanities, by philosophy and history and art. Lord Byron's daughter was Ada Lovelace, the inventor of the computer. Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the writer of A Vindication on the Rights of Women. Leonardo da Vinci was as much a scientist as he was an artist. History is written by people who combine the humanities and the sciences, who find interest in both literature and chemistry, in art and biology, in history and physics. This modern idea that the sciences and the humanities are separate is false, and it is pushed by these elitist snobs who think that only the most highbrow literature counts as valid. It is also pushed by people who remember that innovation comes from change, but it also comes from history and a deep understanding of empathy and imagination, two things that fantasy is primed to teach any given audience. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. I did. I loved getting to talk about history and fantasy and how they intersect. So if you are interested in more videos like this one and you stuck around this long, please hit that subscribe button. And I would really love to hear in the comments if any of you have any other examples of fantasy literature that you think are often overlooked, especially older fantasy from the mid-20th century, or again, if you have any examples of fantasy from the Eastern canon or Asian cultures that I am not as familiar with. I do really love to expand my knowledge of fantasy, and I would love recommendations or suggestions from anyone who is familiar with them to help further my fantasy knowledge and my learning about fantasy, because it is something that I love so deeply and I really want to continue studying and researching and exploring with all of you. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a lovely rest of your day.